A few years ago, I had a job which required me to drive a lot around the country, visiting and liaising with franchisees of the company I worked for. Life on the road, hotels and motels, it was okay for a while. Eventually it got tedious, and I was thinking of packing it in. One evening I was driving through rural Alabama in an area of tiny little settlements that you could buzz through in less than 20 seconds, isolated groups of houses, and the occasional motel. I was on the outskirts of another one of these little hamlets when I saw the dreaded red, white and blue lights behind me and heard the whoop of the siren instructing me to pull over. I swore under my breath, noticing that I was a couple of miles an hour over the limit. Having now pulled over, I wound down the window and saw the policeman approaching in my wing mirror. "Driver's license," he said abruptly. I handed it over. Looking up, I noticed he was wearing mirrored shades. While it was a sunny day, by now it was dusk. After a moment's perusal of my license, he said, "Doing a little speeding, weren't you?" "I'm sorry, officer," I said. "I'm a little tired and I just went a hair over the limit." "It's Chief," he said dismissively. Oops, I thought to myself, he's definitely going to give me a ticket now. Instead, he said, "If you're tired, quit driving. Get going through town. There's a hotel about 10 miles from here in the next big town." I was delighted to get away with it and said, "Thanks, officer, but I noticed a sign just before you pulled me over for a motel, just off the main street." He sighed with seeming annoyance. "I think it's closed." "Okay, I might just look in to make sure, then I'll be on my way." He handed me my license and walked away without a word. I set off driving, slowly. He followed until I turned off towards the motel. I pulled into a car park that had rows of rooms on either side with an office at the front. The place was surrounded on 3 sides by forest. There were a couple of other cars in the lot and a couple of lights on in rooms, but everything else was dark and quiet. Not very welcoming, but exactly what I was expecting. I parked up and approached the office. The grimy door opened with the dull ring of a bell. A startled-looking, scruffy redneck type emerged from the office, as though a customer was the last thing he was expecting. "What do you want?" he said rudely. "A room would be nice," I said. "We ain't got any." "Okay, but it looked like all but a couple of the rooms were vacant." "Renovations," he growled, after a pause for thought. I explained that it was getting late, I was tired on the road, and for safety's sake, I needed to get somewhere for the night. He pondered again, then threw down a key and said, "Room 13, $80. Don't tell anyone you were here, and don't come out of your room till the morning." I thanked him despite the service with a snarl and headed across the deserted car park. The room was a dump, but the bed wasn't bad and the toilet worked, which for tonight was all I needed. Soon I was asleep, clothes and all. I woke up in complete blackness to the sound of low moaning. My first thought was that it was the air conditioning, but as I came to my senses and listened harder, it appeared to be coming from outside, somewhere in the distance. The immediate reaction was annoyance for being woken up. The clock read 11:45. Pulling back the grimy room curtain, there was absolutely nothing to see. The office and the rooms were all in blackness. The only light was from an old Coke vending machine at the far corner of the lot. Still, that low moan came incessantly from somewhere. The redneck from the desk had told me not to go out, but I was cheesed off and wanted to know where this annoying low rumble was coming from. So out I went. The room door closed behind me and seemed to make an enormously loud noise in the emptiness. That moaning noise was coming from the forest behind the motel. I know it was stupid, but I assumed it was just some idiot making a noise, and I could go over and tell him to shut up. Entering the forest, the moaning was getting closer and seemed more human. I thought I could see a light further into the undergrowth, atop a small hill. I was fascinated now, almost in a trance, and followed quietly up the small hill. The lights, the moaning, they were both close at hand now, and I moved carefully and furtively. Reaching the top of the hill, What I saw in the clearing below horrified me. A group of perhaps 20 hooded figures were standing around a blazing fire, moaning in unison, beside which was some sort of altar. I said to myself, okay, I'm getting out of here right now. As I made a move, I slipped on a muddy patch and almost slid down the hill into the clearing. Instead, I just clumsily crashed into some vegetation that broke my slide. The moaning stopped instantly and the head shot round. Illuminated in the flames were the faces of the hotel manager and, terrifyingly, the chief of police who had stopped me earlier. His face contorted with rage. Maybe it was the fire, but his eyes seemed to glow red. He yelled out in fury as I turned and ran, knowing that the mob had set off in pursuit. I'm in pretty good shape, so made it through the forest in quick time. With my luggage still in the car and fully clothed, I just jumped in and floored it out of there. As I hit the main road, sirens were behind me in the distance. As I sped, they were getting closer. I didn't give a hoot that they were cops. I wasn't stopping no matter what. As we came towards the next town, my pursuers veered off, and I breathed a huge sigh of relief. This is the first time I've told this story. Shortly after, I quit that job and I'm happily doing something else now, living in the city, far away from the wilds of Alabama. Back in the 90s, when I was in my heyday, I came up with this ridiculous idea of doing a Route 66 road trip. Now, road trips never go out of style, but the whole Route 66 thing was more of a 60s or 70s fad. I had this stupid idea that I would meet all these kind of Dennis Hopper types. In reality, I was probably more likely to meet Dennis Rader types. To add to my stupidity, I had an old car that was never likely to make it all the way, and it didn't. It made it further than could have been anticipated, but in the middle of an Arizona highway, it decided it had had enough of my ridiculous endeavour, though I was able to limp it to a gas station that was officially in the middle of nowhere. The mechanic was like someone you would see in a road trip film. After confirming that the car was DOA and that he could give me a couple of $100 for scrap metal and parts, I asked him if there was a taxi or a bus that could get me to the next town. He thought that was very funny, but kindly told me that his brother, Chester, would be taking the pickup to the nearest truck stop and roadhouse down the highway, and I was welcome to jump in with him. Chester duly obliged and dropped me off at the nearest civilization, giving me a few pointers on what was there. The truck stop was like a small town in itself. There was a motel, a store, and a couple of diners / bars. I thanked him and made my way over to the motel. It was surprisingly nice, and I was also surprised by how relatively inexpensive it was. The motel clerk gave me the pick of a few rooms and told me I'd be able to stay for a few days, or however long I decided to before moving on. We got chatting and I described recent events. He said I'd have no trouble getting a ride out, whether from a trucker or a regular driver. Not surprisingly, he said the place to find a lift along Route 66 or wherever I wanted to go was at the diner or bar. After taking a bit of a rest in the room, I headed over to one of the diners for something to eat. I chatted to some staff and some of the patrons and was offered a lift from a couple of different people almost straight away, which was great, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. After going back to the room for a bit, I headed out to the other diner for a beer or two that evening. It was quite lively, and again I was chatting to some people who were very friendly. I eventually ended up sitting next to a guy called Ray at the bar. He said he was driving all the way to LA along Route 66 through Barstow, which was perfect for me to finish my ill-advised odyssey. He was also leaving in the morning, which suited me fine. Ray seemed like a good guy. We had a few drinks and a few laughs, and I was happy to accept when he offered me a ride to LA. Next morning, about 11 a.m, we hopped into the car ready to go. I offered him a few bucks for gas, but he just smiled and said, "Don't worry about that." Off we went driving, and for the first few hours Ray was chatty. We stopped and had quite a long lunch. We still had a good 4.5 hours to drive to LA, and it was winter, so we'd be arriving in the dark or at the very least dusk. Ray didn't seem to be in too much of a hurry, and it was his rodeo, so I didn't think I had any business complaining. It was later in the afternoon when we finally crossed over into California. It was nice to see some greenery after all the desert highways of Arizona, but Ray had become very quiet and had barely said a word in the last couple of hours' drive. Then, for no apparent reason, he started snarling and cursing, and I heard something about effing hitchhikers, which really had me worried. We were on a winding road with light forest on either side. There weren't too many cars on this stretch, and it was starting to get dark. Without warning, Ray pulled off onto one of the many dusty laybys on that road. As he brought the car to a stop, I asked, "What's up? What are we doing?" Just as Ray reached down between the driver's seat and his door, he reached back up, turned to me with a revolver in hand and a look of hatred on his face, saying, "You're dead, motherfucker." I'd had a feeling that something was wrong when we pulled in, and I'd released my seatbelt in anticipation. Without a thought and acting on instinct, I punched him right in the face. I can pack a decent punch, and Ray was stunned, dropping the gun and reaching for his presumably busted nose. I took my chance and leapt out of the car, springing into the light forest and running a ways in. Of course, it was much darker in the forest as I hunkered down and considered my options. After a few minutes, I saw a flashlight in the gloom. It could only have been Ray. I tried to hide as best I could behind the greenery and dared not breathe for the next few minutes. At one stage, Ray came close by, still furious and cursing, but couldn't see me. I had a tree branch as a last line of defence, but after those horrible few minutes, he got frustrated and the light receded. There was no way I was moving anytime soon, since I reckoned he would just pretend to leave to try and smoke me out. I guessed about half an hour had passed before I cautiously made my way back to the road. Thankfully, there was no sign of Ray, and unfortunately no sign of anyone else much. A few cars passed and I ignored my attempts to wave them down, until a crusty but kind melon farmer stopped his truck. When he heard my story, he drove me straight to the nearest highway patrol station. There wasn't really much the police could do. All I had was the description of Ray and his car, and the police were totally convinced that Ray wasn't his real name. They reckoned I'd had a brush with a serial killer and was very lucky to be alive. Then they reminded me, as the police always do, to never, ever hitchhike. And I never did again. I was doing some solo travelling this year and got caught up in a transport strike. It meant the bus I was supposed to be getting from one city to another was cancelled, and the only alternative arrangement I could make transit-wise was for a couple of days later. No big deal. I could explore a bit more in the city I was in, then head on. I wasn't in a time crunch or anything. I wasn't rich either, unfortunately, so I had to find an affordable hotel. I saw one online called the Crown Royale, which of course was inappropriately named, as it was a bit seedy. Reviews were mixed. Some people had a horrible time, while others were nonplussed by the bad reviews, saying that they saw nothing wrong with it. I reckoned that, as usual, the truth was somewhere in between. I'm a woman travelling alone, so I was a little bit concerned about the area it was in, but it was fine during the day, so if I just kept my head down at night, all would be well. When I got there, it was about what the reviews prepared me for. The building itself was old and had certainly seen better days. There were one or two people hanging around in the lobby, but I always try not to be judgmental, and they could quite possibly have been people just like me. The guy behind reception was quite nice and friendly, although he seemed a little bit eccentric. The bad news came when he gave me the room key. It was on the first floor, and he described it as one of our best rooms, especially for you, sweetheart. I was concerned because if I was up higher, that would keep me safe from break-ins. I tried to explain this to the guy, but he said the hotel was full up because of the transit strike, and I was lucky to get in. He did reassure me that there was a security guard at night, and they'd had no problems with break-ins on the ground floor. I reluctantly agreed to go along with it while asking him to keep me informed if there was any rooms on higher floors that became available. Walking down the corridor to find my room, I started to see what some of the people in the reviews had been talking about. There was quite a bit of noise coming from some of those rooms. It sounded like partying or just some crazy behaviour. And I also suspected that there may be some ladies of the evening doing their business there. Oh well, it was just a few of the rooms, and I was sure that there were a lot of sensible people like myself staying here too. After settling in, I watched some TV and then went out for the afternoon, doing a bit more exploring and getting myself something to eat and a few items that I might need to ensure that I didn't have to go out in the area of the hotel after dark. I got back well before dark and settled in for the night, watching TV, reading, and surfing online a bit, answering emails, etc. Yes, the place did have Wi-Fi. It was bad, but not that bad. I was getting kind of tired, and even though it wasn't that late, maybe about 11, I turned the lights down and dozed a little bit. I was roused by a rattling outside, then the very definite sound of a sliding window. Oh my god, I realised I hadn't checked the window locks when I first got to the room. Someone had probably left it open a crack and not bothered to close it when they left. Although I was terrified, I knew I had to act. I dashed over to the curtains and pulled them back, just in time to see a dark-faced figure reaching in and attempting to slide back the window screen. I screamed at the top of my lungs, which probably scared the crap out of anyone nearby, and certainly did it for the dark figure, who took off running. I made sure the window and the screen were both fully closed and locked. Then I sat down and wondered what to do. Nobody came and knocked on my door, and I realised that who would notice one more scream from a room in a place like this? Remembering that there was a security guard and thinking that I would be safe now that the windows were locked, I headed down to reception, but couldn't see anyone behind the desk. Not wanting to hang around any longer, I went and shut myself back in the room. Then spent a pretty uncomfortable and anxious night, only sleeping now and again. In the morning I went and asked the receptionist if I could change rooms, but there was still no prospect of it. I decided not to tell him about what happened the previous night, because I now felt a bit less scared and just wanted to forget about it. My final day went much the same as the previous one. Out and about, then back at the hotel, well before dark. I was nodding off and trying to sleep with one eye open, when close to midnight, I was surprised by a knock on the door. I had no idea who it could possibly be, so I looked through the peephole, but whoever it was wasn't in the visible range. I saw an arm reach out and knock the door again, so I said, slightly shakily, "Who is it?" A sinister voice said, "Maintenance." I said, "What? What is it? It's nearly midnight." "Let me in, I need to fix something," the voice growled. I told him to get lost, but then the voice yelled, "Let me in or I'll kick the door down," followed by a boot hitting the door with an angry force. I wasn't messing around this time. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, shouting out that that was what I was doing. The sinister voice didn't seem to care and kept kicking as I fearfully described my situation to the 911 operator. Fortunately, there was a police car just happening past the hotel at the time, and they got there in a few minutes. The sirens seemed to scare the creep off, and when the police arrived with security at my room, I almost fainted with relief. The police were very good about it and hung around late into the night. By 7 a.m, I was out of there and on my way to the next city in my travels. It's always safe to remember that single female travellers are especially vulnerable. Staying in a good and secure hotel is preferable, but if you can't afford that, at least try and make sure you're not on the ground floor. It's an accident waiting to happen.